We spend our younger years believing we have endless time, time to run, time to hide, time to protect ourselves from love. But what happens when the years catch up, and the walls we built to feel safe become the very prisons that keep us alone? The illusion of independence is one of the greatest masks worn by those who lean toward dismissive avoidance. In their younger years, this illusion feels like armor, a proud declaration that they do not need anyone, that they can walk through the world unbothered, untouched, and unshaken by the ties that bind others. They often equate self-sufficiency with strength, convincing themselves that vulnerability is a weakness reserved for the fragile, and that emotional detachment is a higher form of control. On the surface, this gives them a certain confidence, even an aura of resilience that others might envy. They appear untethered, free from the burdens of heartbreak, free from the demands of intimacy, free from the messy entanglements of human need. Yet beneath this carefully maintained image lies a truth they often cannot face until much later in life. Their independence is not freedom, but defense, not liberation, but avoidance. When they are young, dismissive avoidants can busy themselves with pursuits that validate this illusion. They may pour themselves into work, intellectual growth, travel, or fleeting experiences that provide stimulation without attachment. They learn to enjoy the image of being someone who belongs to no one and needs no one. They take pride in the belief that while others crumble under the weight of love lost or relationships broken, they remain unshaken, immune to such struggles. In truth, it is not immunity, but numbness, and numbness is not the same as peace. It is a shield that dulls not only pain, but also joy. As years go by, cracks inevitably form in this illusion. The once glamorous solitude begins to reveal its shadows. The independence they celebrated starts to feel less like an achievement and more like an echoing silence. With fewer distractions available in later years, the weight of suppressed emotions becomes harder to ignore. The career that once consumed them slows down. The social opportunities that once offered shallow bonds fade, and suddenly the hours stretch longer than they ever did before. In that stillness, the absence of deep human connection grows heavier, and the illusion of independence is revealed for what it truly was, a clever way of escaping what they feared most. The soul was never meant to exist in isolation. From birth, human beings are wired to seek closeness, to mirror one another, to find comfort in the presence of another heartbeat. Dismissive avoidants have long fought against this truth, interpreting their fear of intimacy as a preference for solitude. But age does not allow them to run forever. With fewer years ahead than behind, the hidden longing they have silenced begins to resurface. They start to notice the warmth in the lives of those who dared to risk love, who dared to depend on others, who dared to let themselves be seen. The avoidant, in contrast, may find themselves surrounded not by people who truly know them, but by a carefully maintained distance that once felt safe and now feels unbearable. What makes this realization so difficult is that it carries with it a sense of regret. The independence they clung to so tightly has often cost them relationships that could have nourished them. Friends may have grown weary of trying to get close. Lovers may have given up on breaking through the walls. Family bonds may have grown cold under the weight of withdrawal. And as the dismissive avoidant grows older, the recognition of these losses strikes with a force they once thought they were immune to. The illusion shatters, and what is left is the undeniable truth that independence, when built upon fear of intimacy, is not true freedom at all, but a prison disguised as strength. The weight of unlived connections is something that often remains invisible to dismissive avoidants until the quietness of age makes it impossible to ignore. In their younger years, there is always something to fill the space: ambition, achievements, social gatherings, fleeting encounters, or even distractions dressed as independence. They convince themselves that deep bonds are optional, that intimacy is a luxury rather than a necessity, and that keeping distance protects them from pain. But over time, the things they chose not to experience begin to gather in the background like shadows, pressing in with a heaviness that cannot be denied. These shadows are not made of what they did, but of what they did not allow themselves to do, the love they kept at arm's length, the trust they never gave, the warmth they pushed away. Every person carries within them the innate desire to belong, to be seen and cherished in their authenticity. Dismissive avoidants often silence this desire, telling themselves that closeness is dangerous, that depending on another person is a weakness. They may settle for shallow connections, ones that do not demand vulnerability, or keep their relationships locked in a safe emotional distance. At the time, it feels like control. Yet what they fail to realize is that every avoided embrace, every unspoken word, every relationship never allowed to bloom becomes a weight. It does not vanish simply because it was suppressed. It lingers, carried like a hidden burden that grows heavier with age. As the years pass, dismissive avoidants often witness others around them sharing the fruits of emotional courage. They see friends who once risked love now surrounded by families, partners, or enduring friendships that have deepened with time. They notice how these bonds provide comfort in hardship, joy in celebration, and a sense of belonging that cannot be replicated by independence alone. Meanwhile, the avoidant may find themselves on the outside, watching but not fully participating. The very closeness they once dismissed as unnecessary becomes something they long for in silence. They may not always admit it openly, but the longing reveals itself in subtle ways. A quiet envy, a restless discontent, or a sudden flood of memory about moments when they pushed people away. The most profound part of this weight lies not in the connections that were lost through conflict or natural endings, but in the ones that were never truly lived. It is one thing to grieve what was once had and is now gone, but it is another to grieve what never came to life because of fear. This grief is more elusive, harder to name, yet it lingers in the soul with just as much intensity. When dismissive avoidants look back, they may realize that certain opportunities for love, for trust, for deeper bonds slipped through their hands not because they were denied by others, but because they themselves refused to reach out. The awareness of this self-created absence weighs on them heavily as the distractions of life fade, and the reality of aging brings solitude into sharper focus. The mind begins to replay the choices they made, the times they shut down instead of opening up, the moments when someone reached out to them and they recoiled, the relationships that could have grown but were starved of intimacy. These memories do not vanish with age. Rather, they accumulate, forming a quiet chorus of unlived experiences. While others reminisce about shared joys and mutual growth, the dismissive avoidant may struggle with the silence of connections that never became what they could have been. It is this silence, more than any dramatic loss, that becomes the heaviest burden. The return of the shadow is perhaps the most haunting part of growing older for dismissive avoidants, because it strips away the very defense mechanisms they relied on for so long. In their earlier years, they become masters at distraction, keeping themselves occupied with careers, ambitions, hobbies, and even fleeting relationships that never demand their full emotional presence. They convince themselves that by staying busy and detached, they are free from the vulnerabilities that intimacy would bring. What they fail to realize is that the emotions they repress never truly disappear. They remain buried, alive in the unconscious, waiting for the quiet moments when there is no longer a way to outrun them. Aging, with its inevitable slowing of pace, creates the perfect stage for these hidden truths to resurface, and when they do, The avoidant is forced to confront feelings they spent a lifetime escaping. The shadow is not made of random fears or vague anxieties. It is formed from the very emotions the dismissive avoidant deemed unacceptable. The longing for closeness, the ache of rejection, the sadness of abandonment, the fear of dependence, all of these become part of the unacknowledged self. The young avoidant builds their identity around being untouchable, independent, and immune, while their hidden self collects the vulnerable, tender parts they refuse to accept. With time, this hidden reservoir grows heavy, and when age strips away the distractions, the defenses weaken, and the shadow begins to speak louder than it ever did before. It shows itself in loneliness, in sudden bouts of melancholy, in regret that cannot be explained away by logic. What once seemed controllable becomes overwhelming, and the avoidant finds themselves face to face with the very truths they denied. This confrontation is often disorienting. For decades, dismissive avoidants have crafted a narrative about who they are, self-reliant, unbothered, above the messiness of emotions. But the return of the shadow breaks that illusion. They may wake in the stillness of night with memories of people they once pushed away, replaying conversations they cut short, or moments where they refused to be vulnerable. They may feel a sudden longing for intimacy that feels almost unbearable, because it arrives after so many years of silence. In these moments, they cannot escape the truth that their avoidance was not strength but fear, not independence but a wall they built to protect themselves from pain. The very pain they thought they avoided returns in another form, magnified by time and regret. There is also a profound irony in how the shadow makes itself known. The dismissive avoidant, who once believed emotions were beneath them, becomes increasingly haunted by emotions in their later years. The more they resist acknowledging them, the more persistent these feelings become. They may project blame onto others or retreat further into isolation, but no strategy can fully silence the shadow. What they suppressed has become too strong to be ignored. Even the body may echo this inner conflict, with stress, restlessness, or health struggles reflecting the unspoken weight of unresolved emotions. The return of the shadow is not meant to be a punishment, but a revelation. It forces the dismissive avoidant to confront the wholeness of their humanity, to acknowledge the tenderness and vulnerability they worked so hard to deny. For some, this confrontation may lead to a late awakening, an opening to intimacy even in later life. For others, it may simply be a heavy reckoning with all that was lost to fear. But in either case, the truth becomes unavoidable. The parts of themselves they tried to bury were never gone. They were always waiting, and with age, the waiting ends. The loneliness of aging is one of the most profound realities that dismissive avoidants eventually face, because it confronts them with the consequences of a lifetime spent keeping others at arm's length. In their younger years, loneliness is often disguised. They can throw themselves into their careers, seek out surface-level relationships, keep their schedules full, or simply convince themselves that independence is superior to intimacy. Their solitude is painted as freedom, and they take pride in not needing anyone to lean on. But as the decades pass and the distractions thin out, the silence they once celebrated begins to stretch wider, and what once felt like strength slowly begins to feel like emptiness. Loneliness in later life is different from the solitude of youth. When someone is young, being alone can be framed as choice, a mark of independence, even a badge of uniqueness. But with age, the framework changes. The friends who once gathered often may drift away into their own families and priorities. Romantic opportunities may lessen. The family that once demanded energy may no longer be present, or the ties may be strained by years of distance. The dismissive avoidant, who resisted closeness to protect themselves, may find themselves standing in a life where few people truly know them. The social circle becomes smaller, not because of rejection by others, but because they never allowed themselves to fully step into it. This kind of loneliness carries a different texture. It is not simply the absence of company, but the absence of meaningful bonds. It is one thing to sit in a quiet room knowing there are people who would rush to your side if you needed them, and another to sit in that same room knowing there are few who truly could. For dismissive avoidants, this realization often comes in waves, creeping up in the quiet hours of the night or during moments of vulnerability when they are unwell, when the illusion of being untouchable no longer serves them. The self-sufficiency they once prized reveals itself as a fragile shield, one that cannot protect them from the hunger of the soul for connection. The body itself begins to mirror this shift. With aging comes fragility, and with fragility comes the undeniable need for others. Medical needs, moments of illness, or simply the small daily struggles of growing older create situations where dependence is no longer a choice but a necessity. For someone who has spent their whole life avoiding reliance on others, this can feel like a humiliating contradiction. Yet it also exposes the truth that no one escapes the need for human closeness. While others may gracefully lean into their bonds of love and care, the dismissive avoidant often struggles, unsure of how to let others in after so many years of pushing them away. The loneliness of aging also awakens regret. It brings memories of opportunities lost, relationships cut short, and people who once reached out but were turned away. These recollections do not fade with time. Instead, they become sharper because there is no longer the distraction of youth to muffle them. The avoidant may look back on a life where many paths for intimacy were offered but rarely taken, and in this recognition, the loneliness becomes heavier. It is not just the absence of others, but the knowledge that they themselves contributed to the emptiness they now feel. This loneliness is not always expressed openly. Many dismissive avoidants continue to wear their mask of independence, insisting to the world that they are content, that solitude suits them. But beneath the surface, the silence grows louder, and the inner conflict becomes more difficult to escape. They are confronted with the truth that while they spent much of life protecting themselves from the risks of love, it is the absence of love that follows them most deeply into old age. The unavoidable call for connection emerges with greater force as dismissive avoidants grow older, because no matter how firmly they have built their walls, the human soul is not designed to exist in isolation. Throughout their lives, they may have convinced themselves that intimacy was unnecessary, that closeness was a burden, and that they could walk the path of life untouched by dependency. They often took pride in their ability to stay detached, to maintain control, to rely on no one but themselves. Yet as age strips away illusions and the distractions of youth fade, what remains is the raw truth that every human heart is wired for belonging, for touch, for recognition in the eyes of another. The desire for connection, denied for so long, begins to rise with a power they can no longer silence. This call is not always dramatic. It creeps in through subtle experiences that gradually dismantle their defenses. It may come in the form of long evenings spent alone, when silence no longer feels peaceful but heavy. It may appear in moments of vulnerability when illness, grief, or weakness reveals the deep need for comfort that independence cannot provide. It may surface in the observation of others, watching how those who embraced love and risked intimacy are now surrounded by family, partners, or lifelong friends who anchor them in their later years. Against this backdrop, the avoidant begins to feel the hollowness of their solitude. They recognize that what they once dismissed as weakness in others was, in truth, the very thing that sustains life when everything else fades. The call for connection becomes stronger because aging itself strips away the illusions of permanence. Time feels more fragile, and the awareness of mortality brings with it a sense of urgency. What once could be postponed, avoided, or ignored is now inescapable. There is no endless future to keep running into, no new distraction to push emotions away indefinitely. The reality of limited time forces them to confront the yearning within, the hunger for closeness that they buried under years of avoidance. They may not always know how to express it, and they may not always succeed in opening up, but the truth becomes undeniable. They crave the very intimacy they once feared. The struggle lies in the tension between this craving and the habits of a lifetime. Having spent years rejecting vulnerability, they often do not know how to suddenly welcome it. Attempts at connection may feel awkward, hesitant, even frightening, because they require dismantling walls that have stood for decades. Yet even the smallest moments of genuine closeness, a conversation, a shared memory, a gentle touch, begin to take on profound meaning. The call for connection softens their defenses, often against their will, and pulls them toward the humanity they resisted acknowledging. This awakening can be bittersweet. On one hand, it offers the possibility of late healing, the chance to finally taste the depth of intimacy that was denied for so long. On the other hand, it can bring sorrow, because the opportunities they ignored in the past cannot be recovered. Relationships they once turned away from may no longer be available. People they pushed out may have built lives elsewhere. The longing that rises in them often collides with the reality of what has been lost, making the call for connection both beautiful and painful. What makes this call unavoidable is that it comes not from the outside, but from within. It is not about the expectations of society or the demands of others, but about the deepest needs of their own soul. No matter how much they resist, they cannot escape the truth that intimacy, belonging, and love are not luxuries but necessities for a fulfilled life. With age, this truth echoes louder than ever, demanding to be heard, and though they may fight it, the call for connection remains relentless, pulling them toward the very thing they spent a lifetime avoiding. In the end, dismissive avoidants cannot outrun the truth of their own humanity. Independence may carry them far, but it is connection that gives life meaning. The shadow returns, the weight of unlived bonds presses down, and the loneliness of aging makes every defense crumble. What remains is the undeniable call of the heart, a longing for closeness, for intimacy, for the very love they once feared. This is the truth that cannot be escaped. The human soul was never meant to live behind walls, but to be touched, to be seen, and to belong.